Hear me pretty well? Excellent. I'm going to share my screen and I'll say welcome to I think this is the ninth time we've been together as a community climate resilience network over the past year. And it's wonderful to be back together in this new year. But as everybody is experiencing here in Minnesota, this is not an ordinary year. And there's a lot to be learned from the what is happening today in the midst of this federal occupation. And so we are, I'm going to share the agenda. We will have a welcome from um, our former board chair, Jim Bear Jacobs, and our current new director, uh, Jim Bear Jacobs. We're then going to um, hand the mic, the proverbial mic, the Zoom mic, over to Dr. Kelly Sherman-Conroy. Jim Bear will introduce Kelly, but Kelly is here to talk with us about resilience from the perspective of a movement chaplain, but also somebody who has been working with studying, being a practitioner of creating sustainable, resilient spaces for her whole life. We're then going to hear from Terri Burnor, who is the executive director of the Minnesota Unitarian Universal Social Justice, and is it Advocates or Action or oh
Alliance.
my
Alliance.
gosh, it's that A. Terry from Moose Jaw is going to talk with us a little bit about some specific tools that Moose Jaw and others in the UU community have developed to deal with resilience in times of crisis. And then we're going to do some breakouts and hear from you all about what you have been learning and what you have been planning in your own emerging resilience hubs. All right, so deep breath. I am going to hand it over to you, Jim Bear, and I'm going to take the slides away, and it's all you.
All right. Well, good evening, everyone. First thing I'm going to do, I'm going to remove the spotlight on my own screen because I don't know if any of you have ever done Zoom presentations where the host spotlights you when you're speaking and then just a giant picture of your own face shows up. And that's a little disconcerting to stare at myself talking to myself when I would rather take a look and see all of you. Well, greetings, everyone. My name is Reverend Jim Bear Jacobs, and as Julia said, I am until very recently the chair of the board for MNIPL, and even more recently, I'm now a program director at MNIPL. I am a member of the Turtle Clan. I'm a citizen of the Stockbridge-Munsee Band of Mohican Indians, which is a tribe whose current homelands are in the big woods in central Wisconsin. However, our ancestral homelands are the Hudson River Valley in New York State, essentially from Manhattan Island up to Lake Champlain in upstate New York. I have been working in the arena of racial justice, environmental justice, and social justice for 15 or 16 years now. I currently am speaking to you from my home in the South Metro of the Twin Cities. So I am pretty well within the ancestral and contemporary homelands of the Dakota people. If you are joining us from the state of Minnesota, which many of you are, you also are in the ancestral and contemporary homelands of the Dakota people, and probably in relatively close proximity to the territories of the Anishinaabe and the Ho-Chunk peoples. Much of what we know as the Twin Cities was removed from the Dakota people through a series of incredibly conniving treaties that were made, and all of them subsequently broken with the Dakota people. The earliest being 1805 and moving through the 19th century. And honestly, we all owe a huge amount of gratitude and a huge debt to the indigenous people of this land who still today, in graciousness, endeavor to show us how to live in relationship with land in, I almost said new way, but it is not a new way. Live in relationship with land that is ancient and yet still so relevant, to understand land as a relative whose relationship is stewarded in care and love. And I have always said that wherever you live, you owe it to the indigenous people that preceded you to at least know their story. And so wherever you are joining us from, I would encourage you to do the historical research on the land that you occupy, find out the name of the peoples that lived there preceding you, find out historically what their narrative was, where they ended up, how the land transferred from relative to property, and hold that in your heart as you move about, live your life, work your work on this land, and hold that with gratitude. And I will turn it back over to Julia to set a little bit of context here.
You're muted, Julia.
All right. I'm just going to take a couple minutes to remind us the context of how it is that the Resilience Hub network has come together, and what it is that, as a broader climate community resilience network, we are endeavoring to explore together. And so each time we meet, I show you this picture of this boat. And the boat is traveling on somewhat rocky or wavy seas. Sometimes the water is calm, sometimes it's very rough. And the question is, how do we build those handholds that make it possible for us to continue to move towards our goals, to be together in safety and resilience in the midst of a stormy sea? So I like to ask people to imagine, what is the stormy sea that you are encountering today? How is that different from the stormy sea that you encountered, 10 years ago? And what are the ways that we can be planning and thinking and building community and building the kinds of communication and operations and sort of thoughtful planning within our communities. And one of the themes that consistently comes up is that actually, in order for us to be well in the midst of a storm, is that we need to be focusing on how to be together in the midst of that storm, how to combat social isolation so that we are not alone. You all have seen this diagram if you've been on any of our webinars before. But the Urban Sustainability Director Network has put out this call for communities across the country. And MNIPL has said we would love to see 10,000 hubs dotting the landscape throughout Minnesota. And in each of these hubs, there would be a plan. And the plan would have something to do with how, in an everyday situation, do we have programs and communications and operations? How do we manage our buildings? How does that maybe change a little bit during a disruption? So if we had a tornado, as one came, over 10 years ago in North Minneapolis, there was a set of tornadoes. What happened during the midst of that disruption? Where were people able to seek shelter and the resources that they needed to be safe and well in community? And then in the years that passed since that tornado, how was that neighborhood in North Minneapolis able to replant trees, support neighbors in rebuilding their homes, making sure they had insurance? What were the steps to make sure that the community remained whole after the disruption? So as we've done this, and I want to recognize Susan is on the call right now, Susan Silber from California. She was generous enough to share this diagram with us on one of our first webinars back in early 2025. And she invited us to think about 7 steps to starting these hubs. One would going to do some research, figure out what's out there, who's part of our community. We're going to build a team. We're going to learn about what are our assets and maybe where are things not built out in our congregations or our nonprofits or in our neighborhoods. We're going to vision together, think about what we want to be together. We're going to set some goals and we're going to continue to implement and be together in community. So this is the bigger goal. But I'm going to hand it back to Jim Bear to introduce Kelly. But I'd like to just say a word about why I'm so excited that you're here with us today, Kelly. As we've been on a process for the last year at Minnesota IPL, what we've come to discover is that it's a lot to put together a resilience hub that looks like this one. Right. And you can find dozens of resilience hub plans online, and they're very complicated and they involve, kilowatts of electricity and, all kinds of detailed analyses about how to operate a commercial kitchen. But so often, those plans don't get to the most fundamental part of what it is to be a resilient community. And that's the care that we give to each other. It's maybe communications based in a plan, but maybe it's the culture that we've built around how we are with each other and what we expect from ourselves and others in the midst of living this life that is always going to be filled with opportunities to have to grab the handhold. Kelly, you've been a movement chaplain. You've been on the streets of Minneapolis in the midst of this occupation. You were leading us in prayer last Saturday at the Whipple Building, but this is nothing new for you. So I would love to, invite you to share with us, how you think about bringing communities together in the midst of the turbulent world that we have all inherited together. And Jim Bear, I'll send it back to you to just let people know a little bit more about Kelly before you begin.
All right. Well, speaking about resilience, I want to acknowledge my own resilience because I have maintained a friendship with Kelly for a number of years now, and that requires an incredible amount of resilience. No, all kidding aside, it is an incredible gift that I get to be in community and, more importantly, be in friendship with Dr. Kelly Sherman-Conroy. As soon as she unmutes, she will probably express her gratitude towards me as her elder, which she always does. She loves pointing out that I'm older than her. However, she just had a birthday 2 days ago, so she is quickly approaching that elder status. And it has been my honor to know Kelly for, we tried to figure out recently how many years, but it's been a number of years. And in that, Kelly and I have shared space together as teachers, as historians, as theologians, as preachers. And I am never, there's never been a moment where I'm not very proud and very impressed by her. So it is my deep pleasure and honor to bring to you all Dr. Kelly Sherman-Conroy.
All right, and Kelly, we're going to spotlight you. And there is this secret place where you can go up on the right-hand side and say, "Don't spotlight me for me." But in any case, we want to see you. So here it is.
Thank you. I often just am in silence after listening to, Jim Bear speak, because I'm still waiting for Jim Bear to finish explaining how things were done back when dinosaurs roamed the earth. He's never finished explaining things for me. So I'm just kidding. No, honestly, I let Jim Bear tease me because respecting our elders is really an Indigenous value, and we're going to talk about that this evening. And I think it's a lot of our relationship is just a lot of fun, and I appreciate him very much, and I'm so grateful for, honestly, all the things that I have learned with Jim Bear, and just continuing to be able to walk alongside him and especially now in this time, and I think. And just also introducing myself a little bit more. My Lakota name is Matowashde Winya. So I come from, which means good bear woman, and I come from the Oglala Sioux tribe, which is in southwestern South Dakota. So we'll go all the way across it. The Black Hills go down about 2 hours from there south. But I'm also a descendant of the Santee. So my mother's mom and my grandma is Santee Dakota. So when I say Dakota or Lakota and there's Nakota, it's just a dialect. I think people confuse that as a tribal name, and it's not. It's a dialect. We're all a part of the Sioux Nation. And for me, that's really important. And I apologize. I had 3 classes a day, and apparently I talk too much, and my voice is a little crackly. But I just wanted to say that I'm really grateful for being here, and just start by naming something that I think often goes really unsaid, and especially when you're logging into a wonderful webinar like this, right? It takes a lot of effort sometimes, and many of us, I think, are tired in a lot of ways, and in ways that I think, and I can say for myself, that doesn't resolve with sleep, right? It's the kind of tired that's kind of coming from paying attention and from caring and from holding concern for people and places that we love, and while the world just keeps asking more of us, and when lately when people have been asking me like how I'm doing these days, I find myself pausing a lot, and not because I don't want to answer, but because the honest answer to this is sometimes is not as simple, right? Because there's grief there, and and there's anger and there's fear and there's so much sadness, and alongside all of that, I have this deep, stubborn love for our communities that just keeps pulling us back towards one another, right? And even when it would be easier just to withdraw from all of that, I can't. And I imagine like many of you recognize that tension in yourselves, right? There's that ache and then the commitment living side by side. And I think for me, for what I'm going to talk to you about tonight, it's not about pretending these things are fine. And I'm not going to offer some quick reassurance. That's just not who I am. But it's about resilience for me. And hold on, just as my son is walking through the door, I'm going to do a quick pause before my dog starts barking really loudly. Is he going to do it? Okay, he's not. Okay, I apologize. This is Zoom, right? So, I kind of just want to talk to you a little bit about that resilience, because it's not a polished version of this kind of everything sounds good type of theory. I want to talk about the kind of real kind of resilience that actually it has some roots, right? The kind that kind of grows a little quietly underground, and a lot of times it's before we see any visible change that we recognize some of that resilience. And I also want to talk to us a little bit about what healing looks like in moments like what we're going through, right? And this is where the movement chaplains come in, and because they I want to talk to you about what these movement chaplains, what we do, and we come in these times when things are tender and when they're volatile or when they're uncertain, and how do we as ordinary people and congregations, how can we organize ourselves to show up with care rather than just sometimes we show up with a lot of commentary, and that's okay. But and then how do we just ground all of this in some long resilience? And I'm going to talk a little bit about Native communities, because that wisdom for me is something that's not abstract. It's everything that I'm going to teach you is completely lived for me and embodied, and honestly just really deeply relevant right now. And so I know that when people hear the word healing, as I've been talking with a lot of people, sometimes it's this idea of that you have to fix something, right? That making the pain kind of disappear or restoring some sort of normalcy in our lives. Or maybe it's about like healing for some people is like, I'm going to close this chapter and I'm going to move on from that, right? And that understanding is deeply embedded, I think, in how our culture approaches suffering. And I've noticed this for quite some time, and working in the different elements of community, especially since, from Standing Rock to the uprisings of George Floyd to now, right? But in an indigenous worldview and in a native worldview, healing has never been about erasing pain or pretending it didn't happen. And that's because we don't see things in that linear way, right? We actually are in a very cyclical nature of understanding not just the world and our place in it, but those connections of these things. And so we know then if we look at it in that way, then we can't just erase our pain because we're always connected to it. But healing is more about how we restore relationship. And it's about relationship with our bodies and with our ancestors and our family, with the land, and most definitely one another, right? So healing isn't something that you just arrive at. It's something that you have to learn to practice. And I know that a lot of us right now, many of us are living inside nervous systems that are just consistently activated, because I totally am, right? That there's like absorbing all the headlines, or, in my window or my house, it's the sirens or the constant threats or the losses and all of this, that grief that isn't only personal, but we're back into that collective grief again too, right? That even if we try to ignore it, our bodies are absolutely responding to all of this, right? Our jaws are clenching, our breathing is getting shorter at times, right? I notice like There are times when my shoulders just rise, right? And or our patience thins a lot, which is where I have found myself at times in the last couple of weeks. So when I think about healing at its most basic level, it begins by kind of slowing down enough to ask questions that I think sometimes people think, well, geez, that's a really simple question. But in reality, they're really, really profound, right? And so I'm going to ask you a question in the chat, and I'm going to put them in the chat, and I'm going to ask you actually the first question that I ask myself. I'm not going to put it in the chat, but I am going to just is honestly, am I breathing right now? Like, have you ever thought about that? That in these moments of stress and all the things that we're going through, have you ever just stopped to check if you're not just holding your breath? Because I find myself doing that, right? I find myself sometimes like where I need to remind myself to release it and let it go. But here's what I'm going to ask you, and I want you to be really honest with this question, and I'm going to put it in the chat for you. And that is, have I had water today? Like, it sounds like a silly question, but I want you to answer it. Give me a yes or a no. If you really want to be honest, tell me how much, not just a sip, right? But I want you to think about it. Have you had water today? Right? And I'm going to add this question. Hold on. So be honest with your water question. Not enough. Honestly, I have found myself not drinking enough water, right? And we have to care for ourselves. But I'm going to give you another check-in question. So not only is it more coffee, I drink more tea. That's what I'm doing, right? But really keeping us no Dr. Pepper. I didn't realize people still drank Dr. Pepper. But I'm going to ask you this question. Ask yourself this: am I carrying this alone, or have I allowed someone to witness what I'm holding? Do you understand my question? Right? Have I allowed someone to witness what I'm holding, or do you kind of carry everything that you're thinking and that you're holding? Do you carry it by yourself? In reality, although I am surrounded by a lot of people, being honest with myself sometimes is not the easiest thing, like myself, and then saying it aloud, right? I can be around all the people, and I'm constantly talking to people every day. And people will say, how you doing, Dr. Kelly, or whatever. And to be honest, half the time I don't share how I'm feeling. Right. And so I ask that question because I think it's important, right? These aren't like self-help questions. They're actually survival questions. And this is what I kind of want you to hear, because I think sometimes many people, we just need the permission to be able to hear it. And that means that resilience doesn't mean pushing harder or powering through. Resilience means learning how to pause without giving up, right? How to kind of learn to rest without disconnecting, or even just staying present without being overwhelmed. And one of our struggles that I know that I have and a lot of my colleagues have is this FOMO, this fear of missing out. So then we're doing everything, right? We're going to all the rallies, and we're going to all the protests, and we're thinking of all the things, and we're going on the vigils, and we're doing this and we're doing that we're not slowing down, because we're afraid that if we miss that something, we may miss something important, right? And resilience, that's just not what resilience is about. When I talk about a native resilience, so let's talk about this. I want to be kind of clear about what I am and am not talking about. And I'm not talking about a resilience as some of this big inspirational idea or story that we admire from the outside. I'm going to talk about a survival as daily, as a lived practice that has been shaped over generations. Right. And in Indigenous communities, resilience has never been kind of loud or performative. It is always, from what my experience and how I have learned, has been very relational. And it lives like in your body, right? It shows up in the rhythm and the repetition and the gathering together. And I know it kind of sounds like sometimes it can sound like it can be a song and a prayer that call people to pay attention to one another, right? Or it can look like people choosing to gather even when fear suggests maybe you got to stay home and it would be safer, right? Or standing next to someone and realizing you don't have to carry everything by yourself. I had that realization on Saturday, and in a moment where I needed help, right? And I just needed community, and they were there, right? So Indigenous resilience doesn't begin with kind of optimism and all those things. It really begins with truth. From what I learned and what I have learned, it's this idea that it starts with the honest acknowledgement that things are not easy. I talked to my students today about this because one of the biggest challenges we have is accepting community sometimes, accepting that we may not be always feeling okay, but being honest with ourselves about that and allowing ourselves, right, that realizing that grief that we carry usually lives pretty close to the surface. But also, this resilience that I've learned and understand in an Indigenous ways of knowing is that we can actually hold joy and sorrow. And oftentimes those are frequently kind of at the same time. And I remember growing up, listening to my aunties, my great aunties and uncles, and they would talk, and in these communities, there was just this deep wisdom. And it understood that kind of like that we don't wait until, everything is safe before we come together. That whenever something was happening in our community when I was little, whether it was a celebration or whether there was some fear or whatever it was, like there was no waiting. We just came together. And we gather because being together is what creates that safety. And that's what I mean by in resilience, that relationship comes first. And what I see happening in Minnesota right now, that's what's going on, right? Is that no matter what that fear is, no matter what the pain is or the grief is, we're coming together. And for generations of Native communities, they've lived under systems that have questioned their belonging, demanded proof of who we are, and yet identity has never been been reduced to documentation. It has been carried in memory. It's been carried in land, in our language, in our songs, how people recognize one another from across time. Like my mom, it's her superpower of recognizing people and names, right? Indigenous resilience means refusing to disappear. And I think now in this time of what we're witnessing and what we're experiencing in our community, and as we're seeing all this play again, right? Minnesota has known this story before. Native people from Minnesota know this story of what's happening because we experienced it already. We've experienced the state violence. We've experienced the separation of our families. We've experienced the erasure. We've experienced the forced removals. But the thing is, we're still here and we've refused to disappear. And we mean, that we're not going to be reduced to a symbol, a mascot, history lessons. It means that we are present. We are here and we're alive. And we see this story happening again now, but we can remind people that this resilience is you could look at it as this kind of continuity, right? That the steady choice to remain in relationship, even when everything around you is trying to fracture that connection, because that's exactly what is happening to us right now. They're trying to pull us apart. They're trying to divide us as a people, as a country. And that's not going to happen. And here's a line that I think I'm hoping kind of stays with you as I was trying to think of something about when it comes to Indigenous resilience, when I was asked to kind of speak about it. Because one thing is it's not about bouncing back. The resilience is about staying in relationship, right? So that wisdom isn't just for Native people, right? Or Native communities. It is being offered to the world in a moment when isolation, when fear, and when urgency are threatening to kind of pull us apart. And so I want you to remember that. And so when I talk about I want to talk to you a little bit about what chaplains do, the movement chaplains. So I started the movement chaplains back in around 2020 and during that time. And a lot of it was from lived experiences of what happens when just through my own experience of what happens when allies step into certain spaces. I learned a lot from Standing Rock and No Dapple, right? And then George Floyd was murdered, and 3 days later, I'm on a community-wide call, and we're trying to figure out all these things. And I remember going, well, wait, you can't just send Grandma Joe into the streets right now, right? Not only was it maybe not safe, right, but also it was like sometimes a lot of people stepping forward were white, and maybe that wasn't the place at the moment, and it wasn't about you, right? And then how do you step into places in these spaces knowing that you're a guest, right? And so this creation of the chaplains came because they're like, well, Kelly, you deal with it, right? You figure out what we do with volunteers and how we get them to places. And so I took all this knowledge of my experiences and brought this in, and it really is a foundation of what does it mean to be a guest, right? And so what chaplains, the movement chaplains do now is what we do is we show up, especially when things feel heavy as they do right now. Most of us were taught to think that the word chaplain is about people who show up at the end of things, maybe in a hospital after a tragedy, and that's not quite it. That you have to be ordained, that's not it either. The kind of chaplaincy, movement chaplaincy that I'm talking about, and what we do is that I'm talking about like happens in the middle of things when emotions are so raw and the things around you are starting to unfold, right? And our movement chaplains begin to show up in public spaces in moments a lot of the time when fear and grief are moving through everybody's bodies, right? We've been in places where conversations are extremely charged, right? And when things could easily escalate or maybe even just collapse. And at its core, movement chaplaincy is not about fixing people or calming situations so everything can move on, right? It's about creating enough steadiness that people don't fall apart alone. Because what we have found when we go into these spaces is that oftentimes a lot of us, like, we're carrying all this stuff and we have no release. And the streets and the protests and the rallies and the vigils and all of these become places where we can release that pain, that grief. And even the silliness that you see, that's a part of grief. Or the anger and the language and all the things, and that's all grief. And the streets right now are the places where we can have that. So what movement chaplains do is they practice a grounded presence. That means that we pay attention not only to our own bodies, which is why I was doing that with you initially, because you have to pay attention to your own body before we attend to anybody else, right? We notice our breath. We notice our posture, the way our feet are on the ground, right? The tone of our voice. We pay attention to our nervous systems that, we learn how to de-escalate ourselves and what's happening, right? Because regulated presence can shift an entire interaction. And that's really important. So our chaplains are trained to kind of move towards the people who look overwhelmed, or maybe they're isolated, or they're kind of frozen, and we don't interrogate them. We're not there to correct them. We're not there to force prayer on them or convert them to whatever belief because we are interfaith, but we're simply there to let them know that they've been seen, right? And sometimes that can look like a conversation. Sometimes it looks like standing next to somebody in silence, and that's just enough. It looks like offering water or hot tea or something right now, or walking them away from the noise, right? And a lot of times, like, it's been standing with people who show up because they want to, but maybe the situation is rising a little bit more and they just need that calmer presence, right? And so simply just by being there. And so as the movement chaplains, they also, we've learned to hold some clear boundaries and to understand what we're not. Because we are not the organizers. More often than not, we're not the organizers. We don't set strategy, and we're not making the demands in these spaces. Those are other people that do that. And, there are so many different roles in this movement that we see. So many different entry points. We're not the law enforcement, so we're not going to tell somebody if they're screaming and yelling unless it's escalating in a different way. But we're not there to police that, right? And we don't police the behavior. And we're definitely not spiritual gatekeepers, right? So we're not going to impose our beliefs or judge how other people make their meaning, right? Our role really is about accompaniment. We walk alongside people without taking over their story. And so that's what I mean by, what does it mean to be a guest in these spaces, right? And this work, I think, requires a lot of cultural humility. No matter how long you've been doing justice work, you're always a guest in someone else's experience. I just had some hard conversations with some people who, after our extremely prayerful event on Saturday at the Whipple, where we tied 4,000 prayer ties to represent the 4,000 people who have been detained so far by ICE. And unfortunately, there were other people there that weren't a part of our rally, and they kept themselves apart for quite some time. But by the end of it, they kind of desecrated that space. And it took me a back and forth the next day for quite some time before they kind of really understood what they did, right? Because they were moving in their grief, and they weren't seeing anything else other than that. That they didn't understand the harm that they caused by some of the actions that happened after that, right? So no matter how long like I said, you've been doing justice work, how do you see yourself, and how do you remind yourself that you're a guest in that experience sometimes? Because remember who we're fighting for right now. I mean, this is becoming bigger and bigger because really I think we're fighting for the morality of our country and the human dignity, but yet we're still out there, and we're doing this because of the Black and brown bodies. Right? Power travels with us through our bodies, our roles, our race, our titles, and chaplaincy. The movement chaplaincy is asking us to move gently, to listen extremely carefully, and then also just to remain accountable. And it's really deeply physical work as well, because we know trauma lives in the body. So chaplains learn how to notice, kind of like I did, the shallow breathing, the clenched jaws, the numbness, the hypervigilance, right? All of that kind of stuff, help people feel their feet again, slow the breaths, drink some water. How do you learn how to create small pockets of safety in the middle of like a whole lot of chaos? And that matters, I think, for everyone here tonight, that you don't have to be a movement chaplain to practice what we practice. Because I think also this idea of movement chaplaincy is a posture. It's not a credential. Presence is more powerful than reassurance in some ways. And staying on after a lot of things are finished is often more healing than just speaking, right? So I'm going to give you a scenario, and then I'm about done here. But I want to invite you into a scenario that chaplains encounter often. And as I describe it, I want you to notice what happens to your body. And then I'm going to ask you a question as how you do this. So I want you to use the chat. And then I'll be ready for some questions. So imagine you're at a community gathering, and it could be either a vigil, it can be a meeting, it could be maybe a public action, right? And people are arriving carrying all the things. And you can really feel it when you arrive, right? There's conversations are feeling kind of tight. And you notice that some people are quiet, while others are a little bit more restless, maybe a little bit more loud. And you can tell that the energy is just brittle, right? Depending, just because of all the different entries people are bringing in. Then someone begins speaking a little bit louder than most everybody else. And they're not necessarily talking at anyone, but they're expressing their frustration, right? There's fear, and there's a whole lot of anger, and just like all of it is kind of spilling out at once. So what happens inside you when that happens? When you notice that happening, do you feel the urge like you need to intervene to correct, or do you distance yourself? Like what is your first thing that came to mind when you heard that? I'm going to put it in the chat here because I typed this up a little bit. But when you see something like that happening, what's your first urge? What do you do? Okay. Withdraw. Shrink back. Right? This is the kind of fight, flight, or freeze or fawn moment, right? Confront. These are important to understand, right? To stay calm, quiet. Notice I tend to freeze up. For a while that was me. Or I kind of move away and find somebody else, right? That withdraw but continue to observe and listen, that's what a lot of people tend to do, right? And then you don't know what to do next, right? This is often where things either escalate or they shut down, is this kind of moment. So what a movement chaplain does is notices the person not as a disruption, but as someone whose nervous system is overwhelmed. So instead of approaching kind of a more head on, like, you want to learn how to come alongside them. And it's never I understand where you're coming from. You might not, right? Instead of asking questions that demand answers, right? They offer presence. Like you could just say, hey, I'm here with you. Or, you don't have to hold this alone. And oftentimes there's a pause when you bring that up because the intensity doesn't disappear immediately, and that's okay. It's like their body and their emotional regulation just stops for a second. And then that person usually says something many of us are carrying, like, I don't know where to even put all of this, right? Like they're just angry, right? But think about that. How many people in our communities feel that way but don't have the language for it, right? Movement chaplain doesn't rush to respond, but they offer, and they don't offer necessarily solutions or explanations, but they say things like, that makes sense. I'm glad you said it out loud. Because sometimes, like I said, remember, we hold these things in and we don't know what to do. We don't trust ourselves enough to voice it out. But the other part of what chaplains do then is they stay. And nothing dramatic has ever happened, right? There's no big headline, but the thing is, harm was prevented. Their dignity is preserved. A human being is being witnessed. And that's, what chaplaincy happens right before those things cross that line and break open. So if we think about, like, then what do we do with all the things I've been talking about, right? And all the things that are happening is, we always begin with our bodies because we can't offer, that steadiness if we don't practice it ourselves. That's why I was asking those questions, right? We practice chaplaincy where we already are, in our families, your congregations, our meetings. Like, I'm doing it everywhere. And we learn how to listen without fixing. And that's the biggest thing, is really hard for people, is because, like, you want to, like, a human nature of thing is like, Jim Bear, I really like your glass. I had glasses like that one time too, and we just we want to connect to people. These aren't those moments to be able to connect in that way, right? We have to learn how to listen without trying to fix, and how to slow the conversations down. And just notice who's being left alone. So just be the steady presence people borrow when theirs is gone, right? That's what's happening. And I often hear people are really frustrated because they don't know how to be a part of what's going on. Maybe not everybody wants to be on a rally or at a protest, right? They don't feel safe enough. There's so many other ways into this movement and creative ways. We're hosting community care nights where we have practitioners that are just offering some time for free for people. You can get a massage, you can talk to a therapist, right? But what are ways that you can do something like that? Maybe it's host a creative movement nights where people can design their own posters and their art together and they can put it up in their windows, right? You can allow your knitters, right? So one of the fun things that we had from our congregation is somebody is making butterflies, and we asked more congregations to make butterflies so that we can hand these out when we're on the streets. And in my culture, these little butterflies, they stand for that resilience and remembering, right? And so we're starting to have people make those for us. Like there are little things, are those little square prayer blankets. Instead of making big ones, make a lot of little ones so they can get handed out like swatches, right? Soft things matter in hard times. Host informational trainings that people can learn how to show up like this. Create prayer fences, visible prayer spaces where people can see where the grief and hope and the intention can be seen and shared, right? All of these things, because you just ask yourselves, if someone falls apart here where you are, do you know how to then hold them? I think that's the question you should ask your congregation or your community. And then what would that look like? So I'm done. I want to end here and ask any questions, but just know that, as I talk about Native communities, we're here, a lot of, for us as a Native people, we're still here not because we avoided the trauma, but because we learned how to carry it together. And we learned how to pass it and share it and set it down for a while, pick it up again when we're able to. But we just learned how to make room for grief without letting it isolate us, and how to make room for rest without losing our sense of purpose. So I appreciate your time and thank you for listening.
Kelly, thank you so much for being here. And I would love if folks have questions, please put them in the chat and we can look at them together. Um, I'm going to throw out one thing while people are typing, Kelly. One of the observations I have is that people, we're really encouraging people to lean into their community as a place of refuge, as a space that is safe and has done some of the work to be able um, to hold people in the midst of all sorts of possible futures. We can't know what the future is. Um, Sometimes I think people get caught up, and this is a little bit of a white kind of thing. In we've got to know, the plan has to sort of be ready to address every single possible scenario, or like we've got to be able to plan for the known things. And yet, really, it's the emotional strength and the ability to be together that has, that you have described, that is so powerful. I'm just wondering if you've wrestled with some of the tensions between, like, you put out an announcement that says there's going to be a prayer circle. You've got to do that work to organize it, and at the same time, you don't know what the outcome is going to be. I'm just wondering, how do you wrestle with sort of holding both the planning and the sort of imagining the futures, being ready with this like reality that we really have no idea what the future is going to bring.
Right. Actually, I mean, I agree, right? Um, I, I have lots of conversations with a lot of churches, and previously to me being at All Nations Indian Church, been there for two and a half years now. I was at a congregation for 10 years, and it was like, okay, we're going to do a community care night. And then it was like, let's put a committee together and figure all the things out. And then it was list, and then it's going to do this, right? And then it never, ever felt that way once we got to it, right? And people, because people do want to know the plan and they want to know every scenario, right? And they they want to know, who does what, when, and how it all fits together. but what if we just learned how to live in the messiness of caring? Um, and you know, I'm not saying preparation doesn't matter, and it does, but community is not a control system. So community, you know, it's not like a flow chart, which I was talking to a friend of mine a couple of weeks ago about, right? It's not meant to anticipate every possible outcome before anyone is allowed to show up. Community, if we're trying to be a community as a place of refuge, then I think people, it's a place where people can arrive carrying what they have without having to explain themselves, in a place where, you know, someone doesn't need the right words or the right plan to be welcomed. That's the messiness, right? That it's you know, it's not necessarily sometimes do we know what to do, but are you alone right now? And if we get focused, I think on, and I've done that sometimes, like on having the perfect plan, I think then we unintentionally communicate that only the prepared, or the calm or the articulate may be able to belong, right? But refuge works so differently, because refuge should say, come as you are, and we'll just figure it out together. And I think that's, you know, that's how I've seen it in my communities, you know, especially me growing up. Community was always kind of messy. You know, it just was. And but then that's the human part of it, right? I think, right? I
Totally.
think.
You know what? One of the things I imagine is that sometimes it's just about unlocking the door, the literal door, right? It's like setting the table so people can come as they are. So there's a logistics about like, yep, we're gonna make sure that when we come together that people are welcomed, and then we're not gonna, uh, because sometimes that unlocking the door is all that it takes, and that, I mean that's both metaphorical and real, like literal.
That's what we're doing on every Tuesday night now. You know, we do these free community healing events with the different practitioners and all the things. And at first it was like, okay, we got to have this here. And I'm like doing all the planning. And then tonight, this is our third one. And it was like, set up where you need to. People are going to be fine. You know, we got the tables, we got the tea, we got the, and that's all people needed. And because it felt more comfortable that way too, I think, you know, but it's that caring nature. We just want everything to be perfect.
Totally. I'll add one more word to this, which is that sometimes I think people just need permission. Like they need permission to show up with what they can offer, right? And I think we get really wound up, and again, this comes with sort of the formalization of things, right? Like, am I allowed to bring the cookies? What if somebody else is bringing the cookies? Just bring what you
Bring
bring.
the cookies. No.
Cookies, yeah, because it's much bigger than whether I bring the cookies or not, but that's the little thing that I do. And so I feel like, you know, part of what we can do is lean into figuring out how do we create a culture that people feel like they have permission to bring and do and be, you know. Um, so
That's a part of, I think, what y'all do, right? Is that though is you just have, I call them, for my chaplains, we call them accountability buddies, right? You need to have somebody like in your church, you know, because what I find is like, you know, the little social racial justice groups and all the things, you know, they're really great and that kind of stuff, but you all start to have the same kind of mindset. And then you think your church, everybody thinks this way and everybody acts this, and they kind of don't. And then it throws you off. And so like, I think it's okay for not all of us to think the same way, right? And to be in a group of people that you can be accountable for, and they can, and you can have those conversations to help you hear how you are, or vice versa, or whatever, right? Is the accountability buddies is such a great thing because it names sometimes things when you can't yourself.
Kelly, there's a great question from Lee here. They've asked, how do you hold space for others, friends, colleagues, and neighbors? Like, how do you do that? How do you hold that space?
Ooh. How do you hold space? So this is one of those ones like I keep changing every day. Like I said, you know, somebody asks me sometimes, and I don't think you have to be necessarily become a chaplain, like I said before, to learn this way of being, or there are a lot of wise teachers practices and ways that you can grow. I think it's like growing a muscle of presence, like, and in a very human, everyday kind of way, right? And so, like, I have so many different teachers that help me, um, in being a part of that community for myself. There's a book that I absolutely love that I've been sharing it with my colleagues and my friends right now, because we it's hard to say like how you doing today, or things like that. It's like, what's your body feeling like today? Even that's becoming. So there's a book by so Eduardo Duran is one of my favorites, and he has this writing called The Soul Wound. And it's really helpful for understanding collective and intergenerational trauma right now, especially in Indigenous or in oppressed communities. But he reminds us that holding space often means honoring the pain, and that pain didn't start with the person in front of you sometimes, right? And so my holding space with my friends and my colleagues is just understanding that maybe when they're ready to share, what they share sometimes is more than what they actually are, right? It's deeply felt. And I think like Resma Menakem is another one I often take from, because Resma talks about like, that stress and the trauma in your body. And if you want to learn how to notice what's happening before words come out, it's like a powerful way to start. So, the biggest space for me is holding space for my friends and family and things like that is just learning to listen. And sometimes I'll use this Q-tip. Quit taking it personally, because sometimes if you ask somebody something in a space and they start to get upset or they're crying or whatever it is, like, we have a tendency to make that space about ourselves. I don't know if that's a helpful question or a helpful response. Sorry.
Fantastic. Thank you. Um, I think maybe we're ready to welcome Reverend Terri Burnor to share with us a little bit about how, the UU tradition, the congregations that are part of that network have really been showing up and creating a lot of space for each other and for the world. And I'd love to hear some of your thoughts on this, Terry, but also, you know, some of the ways that the UU congregations have been, organizing to create the resilient spaces that we need.
Thanks, Julia. Hello, everyone. I'm so glad to be with you all. I too have to change my view so I'm not staring at my big old head in the middle of the screen. I think I'm still spotlighted, but at least I don't have to see the spotlight view, which is nice. At least I hope so.
You're perfect.
Excellent. So I wanted to start out by sharing just a little bit of an alive the moment that is happening right now to sort of tie in to how I want to ground just a couple of parts of the pieces that I want to share today. And it comes from the line that Kelly shared about growing a muscle of presence, right? So this weekend, I traveled out to Delaware so that I could attend the funeral for my Aunt Teresa. She was my aunt on my dad's side of the family. My dad has been gone for a very long time, and I did a very quick trip out to Delaware to celebrate her life, to hear the stories, to see some cousins that I barely know and cousins that I don't know, and just be with family for about 24 hours of time. And I came back and I had this realization that as we age, there's this inevitability, this truth that our family from our childhood kind of just gets smaller. And I don't have parents, I don't have grandparents left. And so this connection to family has just really gotten tinier, right? And I come home and I'm sitting with this personal story of family coming into a place where thousands of people and communities are having families torn apart ripped apart, storylines severed, connections severed in such inhumane way, more inhumane than the natural course of death and life that just happens as we age and exist and live. And it hit me in a way that I didn't expect. And I had all day Sunday where I could have really been reflecting on this. And Monday came and I woke up and I just felt that my body and my mind and my heart, everything was just completely disconnected. And I needed to take space. I needed to kind of carve out and make room, which I think is what resiliency asks us to do, to make room to see how our resiliency can be regenerated through space, not by trying to bounce back or push through, as Kelly lifted up, but through care and connection and just that understanding of our utter interdependency with each other, right? With that spans time, that spans physical presence, that starts in some ways with connecting to our own sense and then connecting to all that is around us. And I think it's really tempting to think about how that might be selfish or taking away from places and from what one should be doing, or the actions that one should be taking, or the fact that you already had a little bit of that break. Why can't you just go into this now, right? And I think why I wanted to name that is because of this embodied practice of this space of allowing these small, iterative, incremental moments where we care and connect, we live and breathe within ourselves and between ourselves so that we can together help each other carry on, carry us through, and to be able to stay connected to that which grounds and holds us. In whatever way that might be represented through your faith tradition, through your spiritual practices, through the ways that you may show up in the world and for yourself and for each other. And I just offered that little piece of it because this toolkit that I'm going to show, I think, can sometimes be tempted when we see things like a toolkit, right? Which is what I've been asked to share, which I think is such a valuable thing. We think that it is just full of all of these solutions that we can just grab and put on ourselves, right? It's kind of like a trunk filled with clothes or a suitcase or a closet. We don't just open that up and put everything on all at once, right? We can dip into these toolkits and find those small moments, those big things, those connective threads that can be what we need in that moment. And so this toolkit that I'm going to share, and I'll put the link in a moment, but I want to share my screen first so that I can talk through a few things of it first without you going off and looking at the link and getting ahead of it. Because what this toolkit is it's designed to provide practical support, strategic guidance, spiritual sustenance. It has 9 different sections in it. It helps us to meet the demands that call for immediate action, for long haul strategy, and also amongst all of that to make space for rest and renewal and really grounding into what might be going on in our bodies and our spirits. So let me show this to you, because you'll see what I mean when I say it can be so tempting for us. Where'd you go? There you are. I need to be able to see you all too. So this toolkit comes out of my tradition. So I'm a Unitarian Universalist minister. This was created by our national organizing body called Side with Love through the Unitarian Universalist Association. While there certainly is some content in it that is probably more relevant and pertinent to UUs, the vast majority of it is very much universal. This is truly a living document. It is updated regularly, and it is built for anyone who's committed to the long haul work of responding and organizing in authoritarian times. So it's those willing to find their lane, take their shift, and work toward a world rooted in love and liberation. And so when you flip through this, you'll notice there are 9 juicy sections that have all kinds of information that you can dip into depending on what it is that you are trying to do within your organizing and movement work. I want to highlight 3 sections in particular. The first is the spiritual care and grounded organizing. The second is partnerships. And the last is crisis and tragedy communications, because I think those are most relevant to the conversation that we're talking about today. The whole toolkit has all kinds of information that's helpful, but those are 3 that I just wanted to lift up. And then I'm going to also share just one other resource at the very end. So when you get into here, you'll look at this and you'll see this list of do's and don'ts. Each section has a list of do's and don'ts. And on the surface, they can look like there's not a lot to them necessarily. And some of them are, I think, probably ones that could seem quite obvious or something that isn't super surprising. But the invitation that I think is before us whenever we have toolkit or resources or pieces like this is to look into the full depth of what is within each of these do's and don'ts, because embedded within them are practices that can materialize in so many different ways and that help you to know who you are, what your core values, your beliefs, your convictions are, to help you to understand how all of the pieces across toolkits or across the work that we have really connect with each other. When we look at something like lean into community, one of the pieces that I do in my work with Moose Jaw, which is organizing 28 plus UU congregations across the state of Minnesota. And one of the things that I say, which sounds so simple, as just one little example, is the ways that we overlook how we can lean into community in ordinary congregational life. Right? When you are having your social justice meeting, your team meeting, your board meeting, all of those myriads of committees and commitments that are within the life of a congregation, how are you leaning into community and helping share stories and connections, to listen deeply, to go alongside one another in the complexity and the emotions that are part of this work, the struggles, the challenges, the ways that we aren't always needing to fix something, right? What can that look like in the ordinary practice of a board meeting that asks us to do really practical things? How can we also lean into community with that? How can we also make sure that we're not losing focus on the big picture, that we're seeing how what we're doing for this month's focus is not out of touch with the larger piece of why we exist as a faith community or as a community in general. Moving to the partnership section, it's a similar setup, right? There is a list of do's and there is a list of don'ts. Each one of these has much depth that is embedded within them. Being transparent about your capacity is something that I think those of us that are engaged in activism or organizing or social justice work, it's so easy, especially in these times, for us to just say yes, yes, yes to everything. And to see how that impact has not only on our own selves, but on those that we are in relationship with, the people within our congregations, our communities, as well as those that are needing folks to follow through on what they're saying yes to. the whole issue of capacity and doing assessments on the assets that you might have as an individual or that your congregation or your community has so much more impact on it once you start peeling behind those layers. The last piece in this toolkit that I want to lift up is the section on crisis and tragedy communications. And this is the orientation to how are you being a messenger? How are you showing up in public ways that are using your power and using your values and using your conscience to put forward the right kind of message as a trusted messenger, as someone who is centering the most impacted? So many of these, again, are just interwoven within each other. I'm not going through these in depth because a toolkit is something that you need to dip into and explore. But I just wanted to give a feel and a flavor for the ways that I invite you to look at how you can use a resource like this. It's more than just a checklist. It is something that can invite reflection, conversation, for you to take your team and think about how are you engaging in these types of actions or activities, and what are the changes that you might need to make when you think of them as part of a whole ecosystem of ways that we respond, right? And finally, at the end, there are some additional resources, and one I want to particularly highlight. It is the Social Change Ecosystem Map by Deepa Iyer. I think if I switch over here, are you able to see this graphic? Did it switch for me? Great.
Yes.
Great. Perfect. Why I think this particular resource is such a good complement to the toolkit and something worth exploring on your own is this book by Deepa Iyer really gets into the complexity, not the complexity, but the richness of ecosystems that we are all a part of, and the roles that can be used to describe the ways that all of us can show up towards equity, liberation, justice, and solidarity. Again, this is coming back to the resilience that can come by knowing who you are and how you connect, how we all connect with one another. There are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 roles that Deepa Iyer has identified and named. We don't occupy all 10 of those. That would be impossible for any one of us to have. We naturally are oriented towards a couple of these. And imagine how your resiliency can be practiced, can be in relationship with other, when you start to really know who you are, who you could be, and how those intersect and are complementary to and work together with people who are doing the other roles. I think this really helps us to realize that we don't have to take it all on ourselves, that we can deepen into some particular areas that really make a difference and honor the ways that those have just as much power. These exist in a circle because they're not hierarchical. A healer, a disruptor, an experimenter, a frontline responder, those all have particular ways that they are integrated within an ecosystem. And so I think this particular resource is another piece to think about when you think about resiliency. Deepa Iyer's workbook it's not so much a book as it is a workbook, which helps you to really reflect on these roles and the interconnections between them. So I wanted to lift that particular piece up as well. I'm going to place in the chat a link to the toolkit. You can access this as a PDF or as a Google Doc. Again, it was created by the Unitarian Universalist Association, but it really truly is applicable to anybody. And then I'm also going to put in here a link to the graphic of the roles from Deepa Iyer. So I hope this is helpful to complement the beautiful pieces that Kelly shared earlier, and to just offer some practical ways and some ways that you can work, especially in community, to think about and to do some reflection and evaluation and just some good group work on where there can be ways that invite new possibilities, perhaps.
Oh my goodness, Terri, thank you so much for your personal story about making sure you stick with your body and be in the place where you can be fully present, and also the incredible work that you and others have done to put together some ways that we can reflect back with each other on how we show up. We only have a few minutes left. I think I'm going to open up some chat rooms, and if you're interested in staying and chatting with others, we welcome you to do so. The question that I will offer is just, how are you in the creating resilient community spaces in the work that you're doing? How is your community showing up in a way that makes that possible? Um, understanding people are going to go off and get some supper or do the things you need to do. Some people will want to stay on and visit with others, other people will not. But I want to, before we leave, just deeply thank Dr. Kelly Sherman-Conroy and Reverend Dr. Kelly Sherman-Conroy and Reverend Terri Burnor for visiting with us this evening and sharing their experience and their wisdom. So again, if you're interested in staying on, this is your time. If you're interested in going and taking your evening, please go and visit and make space for the people in your household. All right, I'm going to open up some breakout rooms. Let's see. We'll stay in these breakout rooms for about 5 minutes, and then I'll invite people to return. Are we? It says, let's see. Broadcast. Are you guys able to go join these rooms?
It's looking like it. Yep.
Julie, are you wanting?
You know what
I see I'm in a room just with Marcia, but do you want to move?
Are people in those rooms at this point?
Only Chris and Marcia are in the rooms right now.
Okay,
and they're in 2 separate rooms. So,
okay, let's see. Marcia now is. Chris is back. Okay, I'm gonna move Marcia back here. This is very awkward. I'm sorry. I thought I was doing this correctly, but clearly I'm not fully on it. Let's just have a conversation right here. Chris,
do you want to close all the rooms then?
Yes, I will close the rooms. Let's do that. Close the rooms. We're just going to be done with this whole room thing. There we go.
Do you want to stop recording? Or did you want to keep recording?
I want to stop recording. Buff. All right, stop recording.